Lloyd C. Douglas, the author of the book The Robe, maybe some of you saw the movie years ago with Richard Burton. He's in The Robe. He, when he was in university, lived in a boarding house, which means there are a lot of people living. He has his own room, and he's living in a boarding house. And downstairs was a retired music professor who was an invalid. He couldn't get out of his house, he couldn't get out of his apartment. He was in a wheelchair. So every morning, Lloyd would come down, he'd pop his head into the room of the retired music professor, and he'd say, "Well, what's the good news?" And that music professor would reach over to the tuning fork, he'd tap that tuning fork on the side of his wheelchair, and he would say, "That's middle C. It was middle C yesterday, and it'll be middle C tomorrow. It'll be middle C 1,000 years from today." See, he said the tenor upstairs sings off key, and the piano next door is wildly out of tune, but this is middle C, and it'll always be middle C. See, this music professor discovered one thing upon which he could depend, one constant reality in his life, a still point in a turning world. And I don't know about you, but I feel like our world is moving fast. It's turning so quickly. It just seems like it is changing, even in the last 2 years, how much change we've experienced in the United States of America and around the world as well. We find ourselves in the midst of a constant change of looking for something to hang on to. When everything is shifting, you and I want a foundation. We want something that we can sink our life into, and it gives us a purpose and a goal and a life. We want a constant. We're looking for that constant. What we knew 20 years ago as normal is abnormal today, and what we know as abnormal is considered normal in our society today. So much has changed just in a short period of time. So if everything is constantly changing, which it is, what can I hold on to in this tilt-a-whirl kind of life that I'm living? You remember the tilt-a-whirl ride? Remember that? Some call it the tilt-a-hurl. Yeah? Okay, you know what I'm talking about? And you feel like, I can't get out of this thing. That's the kind of ride we seem to be on in this life right now, is everything is just shifting and changing. What can we put our life into that is constant, that can give us a sure foundation? Well, Jesus is going to tell us today. He's going to actually, his own words, he's going to tell us exactly a constant in life and what we can build our life upon for success. He says, obedience to the words of Jesus secure a solid foundation for life and eternity. And not just for living out this life now, but and eternity, these words are. So what are we holding on to so that we don't spin out of control in this tilt-a-whirl ride kind of life that you are on? What are we hanging on to? What are you hanging on to this morning? What is it that centers you, that keeps you securely fastened to this world that is constantly changing, that helps you keep your head above water? Jesus wants to give us the answer here. What we're going to see is what's called a parable. You've heard them before, a word parable. It's a teaching that has common themes, earthy themes in it. It's usually a story. It doesn't mean the story is true, but he's telling a story in a parable form. All parables have one major thrust. Maybe a secondary one, kind of, but the most we're looking for is major thrust. All of the extra stuff in a parable are just window dressings for the story. Don't get caught up in all of the details. It has one major thrust. So we're going to look at what is Jesus trying to say in this parable, this major thrust he wants to give us this morning. We're going to be in chapter 7 of Matthew. It'll be up on the screen here, the first few verses. I want you to be able to see it. If you don't have a Bible or you don't have a device to turn on or you have a hard time finding it in the church Bible, that's fine. I'll put it up here so you can see it. Everyone then who hears these words of mine, so this is coming at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has healed lots of people. He was up in the northern part of the country, and many people were following him, and he comes with his disciples, and he sits down on top of a mountain. His disciples sit around him. The crowds are there, so they're listening on as Jesus is teaching his disciples the Sermon on the Mount. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock, the bedrock, not a little pebble, but the bedrock of something. What was it? What bedrock? He's going to tell us exactly what the bedrock is that he's going to build, that we build our life. The first thing is it's a call for everyone. It's not just to the Jewish people that he's talking to, it's everyone then who hears these words of mine. So Jews, Gentiles, whoever will listen to my words and do them, I'll tell you who he's like. He's like a wise person, because his house didn't fall when the storms of life came. And actually the greatest storm that comes, it didn't fall then. God has always desired more from his people than simply listening to his words. He wants more than that. He wants us more than simply just hear his words, whether in reading the Bible or in a sermon or online Bible, audio Bible. He wants more than just listening to his words. James told us this. He said, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. So God has always designed for his people to have more than just listening to the words that he says. It's supposed to be deeper than that. Faith is certainly the root of salvation, and works are certainly what flows out of that salvation that we have. But faith without works is dead. We show our faith by the works that we do. We don't work to get saved. We're saved and we show our works. But by doing it, by showing that we believe Jesus' words, he says that is the wise person. So the Sermon on the Mount, what's it about? Well, it's a very interesting thing. Let me see if I can give you an overview top picture of this. Sermon on the Mount serves one purpose, and as you go down and read through the whole thing, it's got all these details, but the one thing it's trying to communicate is this. The Jewish people had forgotten, actually better stated, the leaders had forgotten that faith is more than just external rituals that one does. It is an internal relationship to the Father through the Son. So their religious leaders had focused everything on do, instead of be a son of God, a daughter of God. So the focus was on externals, and Jesus is kind of going, listen, they've missed the point. The focus is not on the external things we do. The focus is on the internal relationship that we have with the Father through the Son. So if you go through and you read this stuff like he dealt with anger, lust, divorce, speaking truth, retaliation. These are all issues of the heart. When he dealt with the Beatitudes, those are all heart issues. Internal versus external. So as you go down through here, you're going to see there are people that believe in an external religious rite, and they do all of these things hoping God will accept them. And Jesus is saying, wait, listen, you're starting from the wrong point. You need to first have a relationship to the Father through me, and then from that will flow everything. Don't get it backwards. So over time, the internal relationship with God had morphed into an external religion devoid of a heart commitment to God. So Jesus is addressing that problem here in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus was saying, you've been told a lot about religion in the past, but what you were told is not the truth. Their religious leaders had failed them. They have forgotten the need of that new heart that Ezekiel talked about, the new birth that Jesus talked about in John 3. They forgot about the internal aspects of this relationship to the Father through the Son, and all they're concerned about is doing this, offering that. Jesus said, listen, let me tell you the truth of what's going on here. You're missing the point. These words of mine are everything that he's saying here on the Sermon on the Mount, the whole content of the Sermon on the Mount, which is dealing with an internal relationship with the Father, not external religious rites. These whole words of mine refer to the whole Sermon on the Mount. He wants us to build our lives on a solid foundation of a genuine commitment to the Son, to Jesus' words, what he has said for us, a daily obedience. They had misunderstood God's message because their leaders had told them wrongly. Their leaders misled the people. Maybe you've also misunderstood God's message in the past, but you're here today because you want to know what it is. You want to know what the Bible says. You want to know what the words of Jesus say. That's why you're here today. So maybe you've misunderstood in the past, but I'm glad you're here today. Let's see if Jesus can explain to you exactly what he's talking about in this internal relationship that he wants. Jesus said this toward the end of his ministry: heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. What he has spoken to us will be with us for eternity. His words will never pass away. They will always be there. There are words that we are to build our life on, this foundation of this house that we call our life. We're to build it on the words of Jesus because that is wise to do that. But we have missed the point in America. Our religious leaders have led us astray. Lifeway Research and Barna Group does a state of theology survey once a year, and the 2022 has been released. Let me show you how our religious leaders have failed the people that are attending their churches. People confessing to be evangelical Christians. I don't know between God and them, I have no idea. Professing to be evangelical Christians. Remember, Jesus' words never pass away. They will be for eternity. According to this survey, the Bible, like all sacred writings, contains helpful accounts of ancient myths, but is not literally true. 26% of U.S. evangelicals, a quarter of them said, how can I trust? How can we build our life if we don't even trust the words that Jesus said? Another one was religious belief is a matter of personal opinion. It is not about objective truth. In other words, there's no objective truth. 38% of U.S. evangelicals believe that statement to be true. Almost 40%. No objective truth. It's all relative. And the one that really gets me is Jesus was a good teacher, but he wasn't God. 43% of U.S. evangelicals say, no, he's not God. They have failed their people, the religious leaders of our country. They are not teaching the truth. They're not teaching Jesus' words. But the wise, the discerning, the prudent person, he knows the truth of Jesus' words, and then he puts them into his life. He acts on them. The wise person is the obedient person, Jesus said. It's not just about hearing, it's actually about doing what he said. Hearing and doing. R.T. France states succinctly, the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount is not meant to be admired, but to be obeyed. I'm not teaching this thing like Jesus said to make me look good. I want you to understand what this is all about because your religious leaders have failed you and taught you it's all about external rights. It's not about an internal relationship with the Father. Your leaders have failed you. And when a person, Jesus said, lives by the ethical teaching of the Sermon on the Mount, the world calls him a fool. Jesus says he's a wise person. So when we're living out Jesus' words in our everyday life and everything that we do, the world would say, that's such a foolish position. What does Jesus say? You're very wise. You're very wise. So the storm that comes, the storm could represent any test. It could be any test that comes in our life. But the context points specifically to the end time judgment. That's where the context of this is. So it's not just about living a life that's good and you'll have a successful life. It's more than that. It's dealing mostly with the context of an end time judgment. Secure in a time of an end time judgment. So the person who hears and acts on Jesus' words is prepared for the day of judgment. We're prepared for it. The right standard for living is the words of Jesus. He is the standard of living. We take his words, and it's helpful in some of our Bibles. They're actually in red. Now, let me just say something. Just because the words are not in red, this is the inspired word of God given to us by him. All the teachings of Paul to the churches are also Jesus' words given to Paul to us. So just because they're not in red doesn't mean they're not Jesus' words. So he says, build your life on my words. It is the only sure foundation in a constantly changing, tilt-a-world ride kind of life.